Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday night segment of The Outer Realm. We are broadcasting here via the International Public Radio on the United Public Radio Network 107.7 FM and 105.3 FM from beautiful New Orleans. This evening's segment is partially sponsored by the good folks over at Folgers Coffee. Thank you, Folgers. You know we love you bunches. Tonight, we welcome Mr. Chris Stiles to the show, and he will be discussing everything there is to know about the Shag Harbour UFO incident, also known as Canada's own Roswell. In order to participate in tonight's show, you're going to have to head over to either the International Public Radio or UFO Paranormal Radio Network YouTube pages. Don't forget to subscribe. And we, of course, will be airing simultaneously throughout Facebook, I believe Twitter, and I believe Twitch. And so I think there's 8 different places there that you can check us out. However, if you wish to have a direct response, of course, UFO Paranormal YouTube is the best place. Otherwise, we will do our best to make mention of what's going on in the chat room here, because we see everything from all the different formats. So settle yourselves in, and we will get ready to bring Mr. Chris Stiles on. Yeah, woohoo. So, Bubba, you want to do a proper intro?
Yes, I just need 1 second because
right.
Yeah, I'm just sharing the rest here.
Because it's the groundskeeper's fault, I'm told, and that's
we're
what
going
we're
with that.
We're gonna stick to that. Yeah, that's the way. I'm going to go in and accept this link.
Yeah. Yes, please. I don't have him.
Live link to watch. Okay. Yeah, I'm
getting there for the next one. There, your name had to come up.
Okay. Sorry. I'm 1 step ahead of you here, I think.
Yes, it's okay. Now it's coming now.
There it is. Okay.
I have been watching this gentleman all day today. Just so impressed by his story and his tenacity with this. Chris Stiles is an independent Canadian UFO researcher who is best known for his work on the Shag Harbour Incident and other classic UFO cases that have occurred in Atlantic Canada. He has appeared in several feature UFO documentaries and numerous segmented shows. Produced in both the USA and Canada, Chris has presented at various international UFO symposia and is the co-author of 2 UFO books, Dark Object with Don Ledger and Impact to Contact with Graham Sims. Stiles holds a blended view of the UFO phenomena that he believes features a nuts and bolts reality, intertwined with a powerful psychological psychic component, which includes the possibility of reality transformation via controlled witness perception. Wow. I find him very interesting. Hello, Zach. Hello, Michelle. Yes, I find him very, very interesting. Michelle Millions and she's on Facebook. I can't type, but yes, hello, Michelle.
One spot.
It's a beautiful name.
Of course it is.
Yes, it is. It's very beautiful.
Well, I know that Joe and I talked about Shag Harbour on the Gray Zone Uncensored probably a couple weeks ago. So I had to really research it. And it was like fascinating.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Hi, Wayne.
Yeah, to say the least, I thought it was fascinating. It really is like our Roswell. It was like really amazing. And just to think it happened in this little town.
So small, but isn't that always the case, right? It's small population where this happens. But I'm intrigued by the amount of witnesses and variety of witnesses that saw this, as well as what you don't find. And we'll let him tell that story. But I was watching him all day on anything I could find him on today, all over online. And I'm really looking forward to talking with him.
Well, apparently he is here in the green room. Yay. So we will wait for Joe to bring him on in. Thank you, Joe. Hi, Chris.
Hello, ladies.
How are you? Hi.
Hi. It's great to be here.
We've waited a long time for this.
I've been watching you all day on TV.
My reputation precedes me.
It just made me look forward to this even more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Of course, I'm going to start off basically, with, I always call it the humble beginnings, but what made you the man for Shag Harbour? How did you come into being this researcher of UFOs and so on?
I've answered that a number of ways, and let's start with the word unemployment.
Okay, that works.
That works.
Unemployment it is.
I get it.
The only reason I mention that is it allowed me the time. There was time in my hands, right? And while I entered this world, which was largely foreign to me in my life, I've been very lucky when it comes to work and gigging. So anyway, I watched for the first time, it would have been a rebroadcast on the old show Unsolved Mysteries. This is the one that had the segment about Roswell that involved, the early research being done by Stanton Friedman, Kevin Randall, and others, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I had been unaware of this. This was my first exposure to it. And of course, it instantly dredged up memories of Shag Harbour. And I was watching this with a close friend. And when it was over, she said, well, what do you make of that? Could such a thing really happen? And I said, well, I know it's possible because it happened here. And at the time, I didn't know the date. I knew it happened in Shag Harbour, a fishing village, not quite a town. I knew it was in the 60s. I couldn't have picked the year or the date. And this friend of mine challenged me. She said, Friedman there, she goes, the physicist that was on, he lives in Fredericton, New Brunswick. She goes, you should give him a call. And I said, I'll do that. And she said, no, you won't. And she kept challenging me and goading me. And this is in the days, this would have been 92. This is before the long distance plans, and I didn't have a computer.
Yeah.
And I picked up the phone, used the long distance operator, and got a number for Stanton and called the number. And instantly a human answering service picked up and said, well, no, he's not at home. And we have a number if it's important. And she kept saying, it's important, it's important. So I took that number and called. Turned out he was in Austin, Texas, about to go to a MUFON conference.
Nice.
And I called, but he took 20 minutes out of his day to talk to me that first time.
Super nice man.
Yes, and that was how it all started, and he gave me some real basic advice. And of course, I had to go out and find the date and all that. But real simple things, you're going to like this. I remember he looked at me and said, you know what? He said, you're lucky. He had no remembrance of the case himself. And I said, lucky how? He said, fishermen don't move. Isn't that great? Just these little practical things. He said, it won't be like Roswell. Fishermen don't move.
Right, that's true. That's true.
And, next thing you know, I was out of the blocks, and that was how it all began. I took his advice. He sent me an application for the Fund for UFO Research. One thing led to another. And next thing you know, I was knee deep in the hoopla.
The hoopla, indeed.
Yeah. Well, that was 92. And by early 94, I was on national TV in Canada, and everybody was buzzing about it. And one thing led to another. It was just my persistence. I made lots of mistakes. I'd like to think I hope that I learned from them and went on. But the important thing was I just got out of the armchair and did the work. Learned from my mistakes and just continued on.
I actually first heard of Shag Harbour because a friend of mine was in Nova Scotia, and I believe you did his show, which was Dave Benison from The Long Story Short, here in Niagara. He would have been from Niagara Falls. He was spending, I guess, 2 or 3 weeks, and he went in and he says, oh my God, this is great. I'm going, what's it about? And I think, I'm freaking Canadian. How do I not know this? I know stuff from all over the world. How do I not know about Shag Harbour? So it's just like eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
So,
I don't travel much anymore, but my experience has been, since this took off, that it tends to be better known outside the country than within Canada. My communication, when I check my mailbox, the old snail mail, or, requests I get for appearances or just questions or, document packages, they often come from Japan, Spain, whatever,
Wow.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be a big interest in these stories. Canada, I guess, let's face it, it doesn't have as many, at least not recorded, documented cases with multiple eyewitnesses. You look at even the States, you have the battle over Los Angeles, the Phoenix Lights, like there's just stuff everywhere where people have like multiple witnesses have seen something. Shag
Well,
Harbour seems to be the main one.
well, no, we have other great cases here, but many of them are unknown. I just think that, here we don't see ourselves as exotic. People look, they see something, they often don't report it. They shrug, go home, make a sandwich, as they say.
That was cool. Yeah. That was
No, really, I mean, our greatest weapon in this field isn't so much government suppression and cover-ups. It's apathy. It's apathy.
Yeah,
That's
That's
true.
the biggie.
That's
that
true.
is so
That's
true.
been my experience. But I mean, for example, when you talk about multiple witness cases, there's a great Montreal case, that takes place on the top of a hotel, with it eventually involves Metro Police, RCMP, the military in
Wow.
1990.
Wow.
And this played out over hours, and there's photos and that. It's been done on some U.S. shows, but it's received very little coverage in Canada.
Yeah, I think I may have heard something along something Montreal. Nobody seems to really push it here. So if
Yeah.
you don't catch it in the States, if you don't catch it on television or, to go look for it, you just, you won't do it. You should write a book about all these places.
Well, maybe that'll be the next one. I've written a couple of books, and maybe that's the next one. Is these cases? The some of them have been touched on in brief by books. Certainly Chris Burkowski has some good works out there that have touched on them, but you could certainly do more in depth on some of these great Canadian cases that just deserve more attention than what they're getting. I mean, Shag Harbour, before I got into it, Stanton Friedman had not heard of it.
Wow.
Like think about that,
Yeah.
in 92, and then 2 years later, magazines like Maclean's is referring to it as Canada's most important case. It was that quick, and it had slipped into the dustbin of history. And it often makes me wonder what else has been just lost.
I agree. I can imagine how much has been lost. I do a lot of research, and I have found some really interesting, potentially, UFO connections. But it's a whole other show. But it is really fascinating because it's stuff that sometimes this is so far north and just little communities, and you just think, oh wow, I didn't even know this little community existed. It's sad, really. It's just we're rich with that sort of history. Getting back to Shag Harbour, why don't you walk us through it and let us know what happened on the night of the event and so on, and we can move from there.
All right. In brief here, we'll take us back in time to the night of October the 4th, 1967. It's 11:20 p.m. It's a moonless night. The moon is already set. And at this, Shag Harbour is less than a town. It's a tiny fishing village. Lobster is the main thing there. On this dark night, we had perfect visibility. You could see 6th magnitude stars without binoculars, perfectly clear sky. And about 11:20 p.m., people that were out driving around that hadn't gone to bed like most of the fishermen would have done, if you were out and you looked up, what people first noticed was the set of 4 flashing lights approached from an easterly direction. And these lights had an unusual pattern that was nothing like commercial air traffic. They would go in sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, and then flash again. Very unusual pattern. Most of the witnesses estimated the array to be at least 60 feet across, but some estimates now were double that. Anyway, this formation of lights was seen to hover over the waters of Shag Harbour for several minutes. Then they tilted to a 45-degree angle and descended rapidly to the water surface. Right away, several people contacted the nearby RCMP in Barrington Passage. No one reported a UFO. One of the unique things about this case, people were greatly concerned, and their only concern was that perhaps a plane had crashed. They weren't trying to interpret what they saw. All the calls simply said that lights had gone in the water. We think a plane's gone down. You better get here. Interesting side story to this. The first witness to call in was a young fellow that already had a reputation as a party animal. And When he called the RCMP, they asked him what he had been drinking. And he said nothing. And they said, yeah, okay, well, we'll check it out. He had several friends with him in the car. And when it had gone down to hit the water, they'd lost sight of it temporarily behind the tree line. And his friends were saying, like, Lori, are the horsemen coming? Are the Mounties coming here? And he said, I don't think they believe me. He was about to pull away. Now, there's no cell phones. And the payphone rings again. The RCMP call back and say, are you still there? Stay there. They'd received 6 other calls right away.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
When the RCMP get on the scene, the UFO is still on the water. They see it. 3 officers responded and came from 2 different directions. One was out on highway patrol on nearby Cape Sable Island, and he came across the causeway and he saw it go down. So he saw it both in the air and on the water surface.
Wow.
Once it was on the water surface, it just appeared as a dome of pale yellow light. But there were witnesses that did see it enter the water. In fact, just recently, I tracked one down. The manned lighthouse at the time, the lightkeeper's wife was looking out the window knitting, and she actually saw it enter the water. And she's one of the few people that not just saw the lights, but as the lights entered the water and they reflected back upon it, the water washed over it as it was entering at an angle, she could see that it was a round saucer-shaped craft.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was only this year that I managed to find her and sit her down for a face-to-face interview.
That's interesting, because she would have seen it from up top, I guess. You run up and you just catch it. That's really fascinating.
Anyway, we'll end what happened that night real quickly. When the RCMP get there, they see it on the water. They commandeer 2 local fishing boats and attempt to intercept the object. But before they reach it, depending on who you ask, the description had either submerged or simply disappeared. Many believed it submerged. When they get to the last known surface position, there's a huge streak of yellow thick foam that's at least 80 feet across and perhaps half a mile in length. Contact is made with the nearby life-saving station in Clark's Harbor, and the Coast Guard responds, and they show up. They search through the night until 3 a.m. The search is called off until first light, and they go back in the morning, and that's the first night, and then the fun really begins. But
because that wasn't exciting enough.
Well, yes, you had 7 people call in. You had dozens of people by the fish plant. You had 3 RCMP officers who all saw it on the water, and 1 even saw it in the air. And of course, as time goes by, what they learn is there's no missing aircraft. There's no late aircraft. Nothing has gone down.
Right.
And of course, as they re-interview witnesses and talk amongst themselves, and also connect with 2 nearby military bases that were U.S. bases on Canadian soil, Canadian Forces stationed Barrington at Baccaro, which was a radar facility. Everybody heard of the Dew Line, but there's actually a Mid-Canada line and a Pine Tree line. And the Baccaro base was that end of the Pine Tree line. It was very near where this happened. And you also had a U.S. base at Shelburne, which was the coordination center for submarine detection in the Atlantic. And of course, they knew nothing. And like I say, that's when things really take off. But that was just the first night.
Wow. So, how many witnesses were there?
Well,
you have credible witnesses with a police officer.
Well, that's right. We had 3 police officers, which you could argue are professional witnesses, right? Anybody who was outside and looked up saw something. And the other thing to point out is, at the time, amongst researchers, this was often referred to as the night of the UFOs because there were reportings from all over the province, offshore, in the Bay of Fundy, over Yarmouth, over Metro Halifax, Dartmouth.
That's a hike too. That's
right. But of course, all this gets eclipsed in the media coverage because of the crash into Shag Harbour. Because you get the military involvement. You had officers on scene. There's a naval search follows eventually with underwater divers. So this quickly pushes the other stories, to the back pages.
Yeah, because that's really spaced out. In their investigation, did they go back and explore any of that? Was it the same craft, or was there just a rash of them?
Well, I mean,
They move
depending
pretty
on the
quick.
area you're in, there's some similarity to sightings, within a timeline within an area. But like I saw something that night. I was only 12 here in Dartmouth, and it just looked like a huge orange sphere. And it was mentioned in the local newspaper at the time. Witnesses coming across the harbor and the ferry saw it. Coast Guard ship saw it. But again, there were different things seen on in different areas. Whether you were in Lunenburg or Bridgewater or But I mean, there were other cases that were filed. There's one of the interesting ones is actually an X file, an RCMP X file I recovered at St. Mary's in the files of the late Jesuit astronomer who started the astronomy program there. And it occurred on a dragger about 20 miles offshore of Sambro, Nova Scotia. And there was a ship that was brand new at the time, a dragger with radar, and had 18 men on board. And they see 4 UFOs on the water in the distance, and they're getting radar returns. This is about 2.5 hours before the Shag Harbour incident, and they file a report. And it's very interesting because in the last sentence, he refers to the Shag Harbour thing because it was the next day he had to come in and file the report. When he got on land, he went to the RCMP. And in that report, it says, it's not like anything I'd ever seen before. I watch all the naval exercises. I'm used to everything at sea. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it's like the thing they're looking for off Shag Harbour or off Shelburne. And that's the only mention until I heard the story from the Granby divers that there could have been a second search off the base there at Shelburne. But anyway, yeah, I mean, there was an RCMP X file and, the paper trail. That's one of the other unique things, unlike Roswell, where you have controversy over some of the
you're trying to hide something, right?
Yeah. All the documents I have are available at National Archives, or they were released to me from Defense Headquarters with cover letters. There's no question as to their origin or their authenticity. And it's quite clear. One of the most interesting things, when you look at these things, is that it reveals what the government officials thought, and they thought they were dealing with a genuine article. And in fact, less than a year later, UFO responsibilities were transferred from the Royal Canadian Air Force to the National Research Council. And a few cases are always mentioned in our attachments as to why. And of course, Shag Harbour is one of them. The Stephen Michelet case is one, out in Falcon Lake, Manitoba.
Yes.
And one or two others, but it was quite clear that they thought they were dealing with the real thing. I was lucky enough in '94 to interview Squadron Leader William Bain, and he was one of the 2 majors that worked at the Air Desk. For anyone who doesn't know, the Air Desk was Canada's equivalent of Blue Book at the time in the Air Force, right? And he gave a great interview, and he was convinced that Shag Harbour was the real deal. As he put it, like ufologically speaking, I suppose for you guys, he says the story had a happy ending because it's the one that got away. But whatever it was, we knew it wasn't space junk. There was no missing aircraft. It wasn't a secret military device, So, yeah. And, he was being very forthcoming. He told me about sightings he had off the coast of Nova Scotia as an S-2 pilot on, missions when our coast was full of Russian subs back during the height of the Cold War.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That it's fascinating to me because Canada seems to be, for the most part, pretty forthcoming, speaking about it. It's like Roswell. It's just like this. They still don't want to talk about it.
Well, to a point, these things vary from nation to nation. I mean, there's been some amazing releases in the past from countries like Belgium, Chile, Mexico. It's the United States that's the tough situation where security and cross purposes
up
get
until next week. Apparently, that's the big disclosure week is supposed to start.
Yeah, we're all watching that with bated breath, But I've been hearing this for a long time. I don't get my hopes too high, but like everybody else in the field, I'll be watching. I'll be interested to see what gets released. I imagine they'll tease us with a little bit of something here.
Kind of like the Kennedy files, all that hoopla, you get there and it's all blacked out, right?
Well, yeah.
Let's hope it's not like that. Nova Scotians are some of the most amazing Canadian citizens. They really are. They're incredible people. And Canada's notorious for once they tell a story, it's gone. They never continue. They never finish. What happened with this back in 1967? Because you didn't have internet. It wasn't like now where something just goes at the speed of light.
Yeah, it sort of becomes like part of oral history, I think.
Right.
It did become known around the world in the day. And one of the initial ways that happened was that it became a headline story in the Halifax Chronicle Herald, which was a broadsheet here,
Okay.
and had the reputation, and still does, I think, of being Canada's most conservative broadsheet. Like I said, this thing happened October the 4th. That was a Wednesday night in 67, about 11:20. By Saturday, the morning edition, it was the headline. 2-inch red letters, could be something concrete in Shag Harbour UFO crash RCAF. And it stunned people, and it caught attention because you don't typically see UFO stories in the Chronicle Herald, right? And so it became a line story, and it quickly went out and got picked up, whether it was in Toronto, New York, Tokyo, and went around the world.
Yeah.
So for a brief while, the little fishing village of Shag Harbour and the Canadian UFO story did grab the world's attention, right? And it certainly grabbed Ottawa's attention. Like I say, the air desk ordered an underwater search about a day and a half later and sent down 7 divers from the Fleet Diving Unit in Halifax through Maritime Command. These men went down in pairs and dove for days, looking for it. But in the end, the search effort was canceled. They claimed to find no trace, no result whatsoever, no debris, whatever, officially. Some of the locals tell a different story. Some of the divers eventually told me some different details, but this was the official result, when the search was terminated, which would have been Sunday night at last light. From Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, the search effort. Now, this is a low-tech effort. This is not like today. There's no side scan sonar. These are pairs of divers going down, laying a grid pattern on the bottom with handheld lights, right?
So it wasn't that deep then?
No, it's not that deep, not in the Sound. Which is what the locals call that part of Shag Harbour. Okay. And they eventually dove in a pattern that would have been about half a mile by a mile and a half. This thing, when it was on the surface, was seen moving toward open water in the ebbing tide. And like I say, it left that long streak. And they kept expanding the search area. I have all kinds of military telexes that were preserved in National Archives. Well, I guess nowadays Library and Archives Canada. And there's a file there called RG77, Records Group 77, and we have many of the telexes preserved. And before the internet, that was one of the primary ways that orders. And we have the actual orders, and these things are great. You see these old things, and it helps once you learn what the military jargon means in it. But what's cool about these documents is that often you learn more from the margin notes, what somebody wrote in it when it was filed away and put on microfilm than in the body of text, right? Like in the margin notes, you'll see somebody start writing, "Could this have been a meteor? Call Mr. Greenwood at NRC," and then it's all scratched out, and at the top they put UFO, underlined it 3 times, and put an exclamation.
Telex is its own language to begin with. I mean, I used to use one. You have to know what the symbols mean. So there has to be a lot of translating on that. I can't believe I used to use one and I just said that.
Yeah, and of course the military loves their acronyms and the jargon.
And there's another language. Yeah,
and some are obvious, like CAN would be Canadian Maritime Command, but some of them are less obvious. DOPS, Director of Operations. But I've been sifting through these things for a long time. You get familiar with the jargon. And of course, being in Halifax, being a large port and military center, of course, I ask retired people and friends and people who did serve, what's this mean? And, you get accustomed to it. But like I say, usually what's more telling is not the body of text, but those margin notes that some staffer wrote while they were dealing with this or filing it away. Some of them are quite revealing.
Trying to make sure they don't lose anything.
Well, but then again, as I heard in part of the investigation, we could talk about this for days, they did lose things. And even when I interviewed Squadron Leader Bain in Ottawa, I like how he put it to me. He thought at some point they've been stick-handled by the Americans. The Americans were involved in this search, and these things had happened many times. And a lot of people don't know, one of the things that got released some years back is there had been in the 60s and 70s and beyond a working arrangement between our two nations on such matters. And it was something that nobody had ever seen in the policy, and everybody knew it was there because retired officers and RCMP would mention it. And they always called it the Space Object Contingency Plan. But we never had a copy. And whenever you put in a request to Ottawa, to the archives, they always said, well, we don't know what you're talking about. And one day I've developed a whole chapter on this in the book by mistake. I called to complain, and I always try to complain directly, give them a chance before I used to go to the Information Commissioner of Canada. And when I did this once about a file they said they couldn't find, somebody said, no, there's no more cases. They sit here for 3 years. We just transferred the whole lot in Records Group 18 to National Archives. Sorry, Chris, all this here is an old policy document called the Space Object. And I jumped up and I said, well, that's it. That's what I want. And the person handling the request, the officer said, no, it isn't. I have your request here, and that's not it. And I said, no, that is it. Of course, I'm lying, right? But I'm saying that is what I wanted. I just didn't know what it was called. And she said, well, you'll have to put in a new request. I send one in. Next thing you know, the chief archivist calls me back the next day and says, I don't know what you're talking about, what this is. Oh, I said, well, the corporal read from it to me. Oh, she did she? And I created this thing. And the next thing he calls up and admits that they had it. And he said he could release it to me, but he said, we'll have to come to a working arrangement. He said, because I can't do this through the act. And that kind of got me. He said, because it would take too much time. I'm going to need permission from Ottawa, from every provincial capital, and from Washington, because it shows our working relationship on UFOs with foreign powers.
Yeah, I'm hoping Joe, our producer, is going to be able to come on for a few minutes at the end of the show, because he's got a little bit of something. He was in the American Air Force and or the Navy, sorry. And he does have a little story to add to the Shag Harbour, but I want him to tell it. So we'll bring him on after to tell you. Because if you're not, it really goes hand in hand with what you're talking about right now and the step further that they went.
Well, anyway, like they had this policy, but it wasn't always adhered to, right? And, I could get into, there's all these side cases and stories, when you get to meet the men, the guys who did these things. And by the way, they have their own jargon. They'd say, well, we put a couple guys out with UFO detectors in the field there. And I was going, whoa, UFO detectors.
What's a UFO detector?
What a UFO detector?
Can I get one at Canadian Tire?
Wait, no, you don't.
Yeah, I want one of those.
A UFO detector was a rusty iron rod they'd poke down into the ooze, trying to see if they found something or had gone down in the mud or the seabed, right?
Yes.
Or swamps.
Yeah.
And if that wasn't long enough, you could screw two of them together and it would be 16 feet long, and that's what a UFO detector was.
So you can get it at Canadian Tire.
You can, yes. Yeah, this is not glamorous or high tech.
No, that's what they're using on Oak Island. They must have one in the swamp.
Yeah.
I see them doing that exactly.
Take us to that fateful moment where the RCMP is standing on the shore looking at this. What happens next?
Well, let me show you give you one comment about that. I did some episodes where, I don't know if you remember the old syndicated show Sightings that used to be on Fox.
Yes.
Paramount Television. I did 4 episodes of that back in the 90s. And one of the ones, of course, was about Shag Harbour. And we actually brought down one of the Mounties, and he went on camera in Vancouver.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
And talked about his memory of what he'd seen. But some of the details that didn't make the edit when I was talking to him were really fascinating. And one of the things I remember is that night, remember, you have to picture everything's dark. The moon's down. There's no street lights by Old Highway 3. They're looking out with his field glasses. And one of the things he noticed, and I thought this was really cool, there's a large buoy that's out in the water locally that's known as the budget buoy. And it stands about 8 feet of the water. And when this thing passed in front of the buoy, it completely blocked it from view. So he assumed it had 8 feet of relief above the water line.
Wow.
Details like that, you don't get them usually, that ends up on the editing room floor or something, but to me, these are the hard details that make these stories real and give you the details. And then of course, years later, you hear the Mounties, and then we found, my God, it was just in 2007, I think it was, that, a Pan Am flight flying over early in the night had a near collision coming in.
Wow.
And, we found the reports, and eventually the pilot and co-pilot, I'm sorry, the co-pilot, the pilot was dead, the captain, but the co-pilot and the flight engineer flew themselves up, and, I managed to interview them and get to know them personally. And, this thing, they had a near collision, and they were panicky about this thing earlier that night. This is at 33,000 feet. And that's the great thing about Shag Harbour, with all the witnesses on the ground and the ones in the air and the RCMP. When you put the aggregate of the evidence together, it just eliminates so many things. I've had people say, well, some fishermen told me it wasn't anything. They're all crazy there, and somebody shot a flare. Well, a flare just looks like somebody's porch light coming on from 33,000 feet.
Exactly.
It's a lot different than when something drops in front of you, and you think it's probably all over, as this thing starts pacing you at 500 knots,
Yeah, it was so detailed by everyone as well. There was 4 lights, there was lights following it. Like everybody had
Oh,
the
yeah.
same account. So it's really hard that's crazy to say it was a flare.
Well, and like to say, when you consider the reaction, the fact that nobody reported a UFO, this is in so many ways breaks the mold. It's a very un-American story.
Right. No,
Yeah.
I think the fact that you have all of these people working together, you have the police, you have the military, and I mean, nothing's being really hidden. It's just all out there. They're getting the fishing boats, they're going out, they're having a look. Like the public is really being kept in the loop. Everybody's sort of watching what's going on, whereas you go to Roswell, it's just like you didn't see anything.
No.
Okay. They show up at your door. You didn't see
Yeah.
a thing. It was a weather balloon.
The
All
other
right.
problem there is the other problem here is you get 3 different places to say, no, this is the crash site. No, this is the crash site. No, this is the crash site.
Exactly.
In here, they thought it was a plane, so they're looking for survivors. Their minds were somewhere else. That's why they were so persistent and rushing over, looking to see if anybody had survived any of this.
The term UFO was never applied by the witnesses. That was applied by the authoritarian agencies, which is very appropriate when you consider the fact that UFO is actually a military term. It was first used in 1952 by the United States Air Force. But in this case, nobody referred to it or reported it as that. And in fact, many of them were reluctant to believe that at all. They thought, well, maybe it's a secret military device. Maybe it's this. They had a lot of trouble grasping the concept and why that would be. One of the things when I present on a stage and you have a U.S. audience, I don't travel much anymore, but I did for a number of years do a lot of conferences down in the U.S. and sometimes they came up here for ones we had here in Nova Scotia. And one of the things I used to get across, I used to kind of wake them up from the start, is when I was setting the scene and describing what happened that night. I go, look, it's October the 4th, 1967. There is no Roswell. And they go, whoa, wait, Chris, that was 1947. Yes. And everybody had forgotten about it. Like until Friedman and the others started looking into this in the 80s, Roswell was forgotten.
That's
you ask
20
any
years.
UFO researcher, they'd say these things don't crash. They're all weather craft. That was the prevalent belief, through the 60s and the 70s, right? Roswell was not an influence on how people, obviously not, because none of them even reported a UFO, right? And you have to kind of set that scene. It's 1967. You look at UFO books at the time, they don't mention Roswell. I've only ever found one that has, from before Friedman's research. And that it's a rather famous one, but it's not one people nowadays would have read. Flying Saucer Serious Business by Frank Everett is the only book I've seen that mentions the Roswell incident. And it only gets a couple of sentences. Yes.
Oh, it's interesting.
It had been forgotten. Like Shag Harbour.
Like Shag Harbour. Yeah.
But boy, did Roswell come back. There will be T-shirts and there will be, and, of course there is for Shag Harbour. There's a coin. There's a whatever. But
there's
still
a sign.
Yeah.
There's a sign out there.
There's a museum.
There's a sign. Yeah, there's an interpretive center.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm more comfortable with that than a museum.
Yeah, they call it a museum. I was watching it on YouTube. I went, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Used to be a general store. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Just a little place. Yeah.
Quite
But
impressive for there.
It's near where it happened, and you can get answers there, and people will take you to the spot usually.
Yeah.
Everything is up in the air right now in the time of COVID. They're hoping to open this summer, but
I
it's a
know.
great little place. A lot of friendly people.
Oh, Nova Scotia is beautiful.
But I mean, it did hit like tabloids and everything. I mean, it
it
was out there.
Even. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, the rest of the world had to find out about it somehow, I guess. It's just all retaining it. And the rest of us are like, what? So,
yeah. And there was follow-up articles. And of course, there was a debunking effort in the Herald because, they wanted to distance themselves from this when they said, oh my God, what have we started? Because this was not the image the paper wanted to portray. And I mean, I could spend all night, but like, there's a great story there because, the reporter that wrote it, he went around to all his colleagues and he thought, geez, can we print this here? Like, is this real? And everybody kept looking at it and they were telling, Ray McLeod was the reporter. He was just a new young fellow there. And they were like, oh God, Ray, we no, take it to Wilkie, take it to this guy. He went through the chain, and when he got to the managing night editor, a gentleman called Harold Shea, he looked at it, he read it, and he said, you checked these sources? You actually talked to this guy in Ottawa? Yeah, whatever. Great, he says. It's going to be the headline story.
Wow.
And they both nearly got fired over it come Monday morning.
Oh my God.
They got called into the office, and it was like a scene from Lou Grant.
I know.
I love that.
The owner of the paper was pacing back and forth on the phone, and he said, and he just points at it, makes them all sit down, and he hangs up the phone and starts ringing right away, and he throws in the corner. He goes, "You hear what that? You know what that is?" He goes, "We're scaring people. We are not in the business of scaring people."
Understood.
He looks at the managing night editor, says, "You're coming up to the day shift." He goes, "What were you thinking, Harold? You're a good man." And he looks at the reporter and he says, "You know what you're going to be doing from now on? You're going to be covering weddings,
That
bar
is a Lou
mitzvahs,
Grant
Those
moment.
kind of special events.
weddings, bar mitzvahs, and cement pourings."
Oh my gosh, you're killing me, Chris. You're killing me. First the telex, then Lou Grant. I'm like so into this.
I know, we're so back in time right now. I love it.
It was a simpler time, right?
It was a great time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't know about Shag Harbour because I was born in 69. My husband was born in 67. And then when I started reading about it, and I had the pleasure and the honor of interviewing Stan Freeman a few years ago, and he never talked about it. And I credit a lot of what I learned was from that interview. And I wish that I had known about it because I would have brought it up with him. And he was a great man. He really understood how important it was to tell the story.
Well, he gave a lot of time and helped me. He himself, didn't tend to promote it or bring it up in any way, but he was, anything I ever asked of him to do or to make a connection or, he was great. I remember meeting him here. It would have been 93 at the Agricultural College. He was giving a lecture in Truro, and I drove down to see him. And next thing I know, I think it was a couple of weeks later, we were on the Deanie Petty show that used to be on in Toronto.
I remember still. There we go.
Yeah, she's still out there. She has a clothing line.
Petty.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I remember Deanie Petty.
Yeah, she was a helicopter pilot before that, and I think went back to that for a while.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
She was an incredible anchor woman. But yeah, wow. That's crazy.
That's a way back machine for sure.
Yeah.
I still love her.
Yeah.
We all did.
Before Shag Harbour, I traveled quite a bit in trucks and vans and that years ago, but I never flew until then. And the first time I ever flew was to go up to that show. And then the next thing I lived out of a suitcase for the next few years, just going around. It was a very exciting time,
Mm-hmm.
And now we're told not to leave the neighborhood in Nova Scotia. We're under lockdown again.
Us too.
Us too.
It's been 3 months.
Yeah, the numbers are coming. Well, we were doing really great till about a month and a half ago.
I
Right?
saw that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we were just down in double digits for the year. A couple times we crushed it to zero, and then it just whoosh, exploded.
We haven't been to zero thanks to Toronto.
Yeah.
All of
Wow.
Ontario's locked down, sadly. Yeah, it's been since March. It's been crazy. Just really crazy. But what are you going to do? You got to do what you got to do, right?
We're going to come out of it. We're all going to come out of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now you mentioned we'll go back to Shag Harbour. There were 3 days of investigating. They did an extensive underwater search. They came up with nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, did they have their theories on where it went? Because I know out in that area, there's a lot of stories. Oh, this underwater base. There's a triangle out there. There's which would create like this big vortex. And,
well, there's a lot of story, and eventually the divers told me what's become known as the Shelburne story. And I'm always clear when I'm doing a presentation that it remains a story. There's evidence that supports that something happened. It's ambiguous. There's no doubt that Shag Harbour happened and that something unconventional came down and entered the water there. And, for practical purposes, it's that old term. It's, like a flying saucer. So it wasn't anything. I mean, if we had something that was both aerodynamic and hydrodynamic back then, it would have been so great to use in Vietnam. Think about it over there. But we don't have anything like that now, and we didn't have anything like that then. The Shelburne story, what that's about is the idea that once the UFO gets away out of Shag Harbour and in that shallow bottom, if something substantial had been there or some artifact or the object itself, it would have been quickly found. So you have to wonder, first of all, what's that size? Even if you want to argue it wasn't a UFO, entered the water, and how did it get away underwater? And everybody's seen it enter, right?
Yeah.
So, but what the divers claimed is that it got away under the water and came to rest on the seabed about 20 miles away up near the Shelburne base, out off a place called Government Point, halfway between there and McNutt's Island. And that it sat there for a week, and when divers went out there and went down to take a look, and this part was never public at the time. This is the black box part of the case if you accept the Shelburne story. And I always careful. I still call that the story. This is the part still lacking the hard evidence. And God, I've certainly looked for it. I went through all the ship's logs and the Canadian Navy, tried to find corroborating witnesses, lighthouse records, etc., that would back this up. And it remains a story. Shag Harbour definitely happened. Crash of a mysterious object in the water. Shelburne, I don't know. But if you accept it, what they said is that 2 UFOs were there and one was giving assistance to the other. And the divers, once they saw that was happening and there was actually beings in the water, that it became just a mission of observation. When they first went to the area, they had, the idea that something was down there and that it might have been the object because they've been tracking it with sonar buoys that were being dropped from S2s and Argus out of Greenwood. But when they got there and saw that, they were told just to observe, and they sat there for a week, and they claimed that after 2 weeks, these 2 objects moved underwater down into the Gulf of Maine, broke the surface, and flew away. And in fact, of course, 1 week later to the hour after Shag Harbour, you have sightings all reported, seeing just that, 2 sets of lights again come up out of the water and fly away at night out into the Gulf of Maine.
Joe actually confirmed that story. Our producer.
Yeah, and that one too was also in the National Enquirer and many newspapers. Right? That's become known as the Cameron sighting, which was the family that 4 members of the family stood out and watched that for some time, right?
Wow.
And that was like, say, 1 week later to the hour. And one of the teasers I know when the divers first told me about the Shelburne story was they said we sat over this thing for a week, and when I saw that and looked at the time frame and it was 1 week to the hour, you're like, and they didn't know I was coming to knock on their doors or find them. Like, it makes you wonder. But Shelburne remains a story. We don't have the hard documents and the people to put their name on it the way that they have with Shag Harbour. The Shag Harbour, it's like rock and roll. It's too late. You can't make it go away. Like, I used to laugh. I remember Jerry Garcia, I saw him interviewed once, and he says, "Yeah, the FBI can't do nothing, but the CIA can't. Rock and roll's happened. It's too late. They couldn't hide it away. It's here."
Agreed.
And Shag Harbour was like that. You had 70 people
Yeah.
standing around by the fish plant, and 3 RCMP officers, reporters showing up. You couldn't say, no show here, go home, nothing. Wasn't like that. And of course, Canada. You got to remember this too. Part of this is Canada. Canada in 68 is not New Mexico in 47. In 67, I should say, is not. It's very different. You just can't tell people, "Oh, it's a weather balloon," or "Go home. You can't be here," or whatever.
No, that's not going to wash.
People wouldn't put up with it here. And our expectations of that. Let's not say we aren't occasionally hoodwinked or led by the nose, but overall, you know what I mean. Things do tend to be more open. It's not just, I'm not trying to wave the Canadian flag, but part of it too was the time frame, the 60s. You can tell people things.
Oh, it's
not
the
everybody did what
the
their
whole
mother
love and
told
peace
them.
movement
Yeah.
in the 60s here. We loved our hippie movement. We loved everything. Yeah, go ahead, Amelia. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to ask, are we positive that it was just one craft, that there weren't other ones that followed it in?
Well, no.
Because
Actually, the local resident, when you look at the timeline in the RCMP reports, that's one of the things. And when you consider what time, when you look at the exact time witnesses called in and where they were seeing it from, the belief is that, nobody saw the two in the sky at the same time, but there are actually two in the Shag Harbour area is the belief.
Okay.
Yeah. When you go back and go through.
Thought.
But I can't say that 100%, but that's inferred in the evidence and the timeline, right? What we are sure of is that one entered the water, had an unusual light pattern, and there were witnesses. They were very hard to track down. Some of them, I'm still finding them. They went out of province, remarried or whatever, that saw that moment when it entered the water. Because those first 7 people that called, they all lost sight of it behind tree lines and such, right?
Absolutely,
But when I talk about the manned lightkeeper, that lighthouse was on an island. And the object was actually coming toward the island, when it entered the water. And the lightkeeper's wife was sitting at home knitting, looking out the window. And I guess she was like, "Oh my God," and jumped to her feet. And you can imagine, right?
Oh my God.
Yeah, I'd be like, oh. Nowadays, everybody be grabbing their cell phones, click, 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 click. And it's really hard to hide a story like that. But back then.
Yeah, you have to see it in that context. It's like the pilots that flew Pan Am 160. That's the last chapter of my book, Impact to Contact, and we only found them like 10 years ago or so. I'm terrible with the dates here, but I mean, when I first interviewed them on the phone before I met Ralph Lowinger face to face, and that I can remember the flight engineer talking to him, and it was all those years later. And when he's telling me on the cell phone, you could hear the emotion in his voice. You could hear the fear and the apprehension when he recounts what it was like and how close they came. Like you said, we thought it was all over. That was it. We're done. I mean, and, when you're recounting something from 50 years ago and you're evoking that kind of emotion, like for, men who have that kind of training and that kind of coolness about them, in heated situations, note these things right away. And I've investigated enough of these things now. There's little things you look for that are tells, on the genuine cases that just stand out,
Yes.
You have to see that emotional reaction, and
it seems to be
different time. Sorry.
The East Coast itself seems to be a bit of a hot zone. I mean, have there been any other incidents since that time that have been documented? Because I'm sure they've been there, but
there's been all kind. In fact, I never thought I'd be lucky enough. Like I saw something. I wasn't in Shag Harbour. I was a 12-year-old boy here in Metro Halifax, Dartmouth, when I last saw a UFO that I could say, well, that was a UFO. That wasn't a Sea King or a plane or a meteor or whatever. But in 2018, not far from Shag Harbour, I was on Cape Sable Island, and we had a daytime sighting, but not a cloud in the sky that lasted an hour, 20 minutes, and there's video of it. And, again, we had multiple witnesses of that, and it was something very unusual. And what we saw was an orb, and when it came close, it disappeared a few times and reappeared. I believe it was probably very similar to what had been seen in the Atlantic by the Theodore Roosevelt pilots. Now, this is not the Tic Tac sightings in the Pacific, but there have been sightings in 2014 off the coast of Virginia by F-16 pilots flying off the deck of the USS Teddy Roosevelt. And what they saw was orbs that were kind of clear or at least translucent, and there were cubes inside them. And this is what we saw when it was at its closest. We were kind of seeing it vertices on, so it kind of looked like almost like a peace symbol when you're seeing it corner on inside the. But we saw this in the daytime. I was actually in Yarmouth, and numerous people started calling me and asking me where I was, and they were hoping I was in Shag Harbour. I said, "Well, I'm not in Shag Harbour." Well, they were like, "We're seeing the UFO right now," and it was a bright sunny day with no clouds over Cape. You got to get here. So I figured, yeah, I'll get here. Well, I've been on many of these chases since I've been involved with you know, as a civilian UFO investigator. You know what happens? It's like the one that got away. You get there, and that's it. We even made some wrong turns on the way from Yarmouth to there. I had a local person that was helping navigate. We made some poor decisions. It took me an hour to get there, so I figured it's definitely over. But no, when we got there, it wasn't over. And I got there for the last 7 minutes of the sighting, but it turned out, luckily, it was the best 7 minutes. Because when I first got there, this thing had moved out to sea, and it was just a dot, a bright, shiny dot in the distance. Now, this was on a bright, sunny day. But then it started coming in our direction, and twice it disappeared. And the last time it reappeared, you could see it was like I had a pair of 8-power binoculars with me, a good set of Steiners, and I got them right on it. And it was like the apparent size of the full moon. It was probably a few thousand feet up. And whatever it was clear. And you could see this cube inside it. It had this black ring around it. And when it reappeared, it started as a black dot that grew, and then poof, it became this thing. And it was just awesome, you know. And everybody on the beach was looking up at it. And there's some video shot. Unfortunately, the video that was shot was before it was really close, and eventually the batteries go dead because the guy thought, well, when you see it, you got to shoot it, then you take what you can. But yeah, the total sighting lasted an hour 20 minutes. There was at least 60 witnesses that we recorded. This is in the daytime, so 52 years later, I finally got to see a second one that you looked at it and you knew, again, that's not a Sea King, and it's not a light plane or whatever. And it was just awesome. You know, we stood.
They'll tell you anything.
Yeah. Look, we went down by the water's edge, and we were so entranced looking up at it at the end. A little rogue wave come in, and we all got wet feet. Just all like just angled up and focused on this. You know, it was really something. It was September 15th, 2018. So that's a long answer to your question, but is it still happening? Yes. How do we know? I actually saw that one. And Cape Sable Island is about 5 miles as the crow flies from Shag Harbour.
Wow.
Now, some people get confused when they're in other parts of Canada. I'm not talking about Sable Island out in the Atlantic. That's, a couple hundred miles off the coast.
Right.
But Cape Sable, there's a causeway that goes over to it. And like I say, you're talking 5-6 miles from Shag Harbour. And so are things still happening there? Yeah. And I know because I saw them ourselves, and we have the video of it, in fact, there's a TV show that we recently did. There's a new series coming out, and I'm not even sure what the working title is, but I think they're going to use that clip in it too. So hopefully
exciting.
Yeah. I'm not the copyright holder. I wasn't shooting the video, but I got there at the end and caught, like I say, the last 7 minutes of the sighting. And I'll tell you, charge my bad. It's been a long time since I saw something, because people see things, and I'd be the first to tell you, and most of them are misidentification. People are great observers, but they're bad interpreters. They tend to over-interpret. But what we saw that day in the day was definitely something otherworldly. I don't know if it was extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional or something. Some of what we seen almost led me to believe it was a living thing itself.
Oh, really? What's
that? And
there's a lot of theories with that.
The kind of cat and mouse behavior, and like one of the witnesses said to me that was standing there, they were all kind of in shock, and one looked at me and he said, "Man, it doesn't even care." And the more I watched the behavior and how it came and went, I thought of that, years ago in the 70s, the 80s, and even in the late 60s, there were some researchers that considered that some of the orb sightings were, in fact, living creatures themselves we were seeing. That, get this, may or may not be extraterrestrial. They may
May or
be
may not.
No, that's right. They could be extra dimensional, but some people think they represent, get this is a concept I haven't heard in a long time, that there could be a shadow biosphere here on the Earth.
Super cool.
Yeah. And that these things under certain conditions only become apparent. And one of the researchers back in the day, a New Zealander called Trevor Constable, used to try to film them when you couldn't see them with ultraviolet film, and he had some varying degrees of success. Now, this is a theory with his passing that kind of fell by the wayside. But when I've looked at the pictures he's taken, when I look at what I saw that day and the behavior, like I said, that's another possibility, And when you look at biology right now, there's a revolution going on there where some of the people looking at the origins of life think that, there was an RNA world before there was a DNA world, and that it could have also involved, panspermia, that seeded life here, but that there could be other forms of life here. And I've seen this in some of the works right now that are being considered. You'll find articles about this in Wikipedia that could suggest that there is a shadow biosphere and there's life on Earth. Even things like desert varnish could be a crude form of life that we don't recognize as such. So what if these things
I would agree
are,
with that.
Yeah, so maybe these things slip out from another dimension, or maybe they're not normally visible. I don't know. But I mean, the behavior of some of these orbs, almost makes you think that, because they don't appear to be technology or craft as such, right? But they're behaving in such a way, almost like they were a living creature. I mean, they could be a probe.
It makes sense, because when they were talking about how the when it went into the water and they were there and they were saying how it was yellow like sulfur, some could smell sulfur, some didn't smell anything, and how they would put it through sieve and it would just dissipate. It does make sense that it's something biological or different in that way, that it just disappears.
I mean, dimensionally speaking, we do have layers.
Yeah.
Right.
Now what they did see in Shag Harbour probably was a structured craft, and is different than the orbs. But I think that the unknowns, have multiple causes. You know what I mean? Like, it's not all, it's some little gray guys from Zeta Reticuli. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I think that the unknowns have multiple causes. And, hence these orbs, they could be technology, they could be probes, but they could be living things themselves that we don't recognize as such.
Well, our guest, Dolly, in the chat room, she's one of our regulars and also pretty well versed on the topic, but she says the crafts are AI.
Well, it could be.
Yeah, it's
I leave
interesting.
that to smarter than myself. I'm just trying to drag these cases into the light of day and say, listen, they can't be denied, and science is in default for not looking into it, right?
Yes, no, for sure.
I leave it to greater minds than mine to figure out what the point of origin is over the mission, if any. I'm just saying these things are happening, and something. Most people, like they say, they go home, they're worried about paying the power bill. They can ignore it. They can say, "Oh, it's just a bunch of foolishness," right? But if you're an RCMP officer, if you're an air traffic controller, and you get called to one of these incidents, you don't get that luxury. You do not get the luxury of disbelief. You have to deal with it. You have to write a report.
Absolutely. It's all what you saw and when. It's all science at that moment.
Write what you see, they tell them. That's their training, right?
That's all you can do.
But you can't sit there and say, well, no, I don't have to go to that. That's foolishness. You don't get the luxury. I mean, if you're an air traffic controller and, you got a 747 coming in with hundreds of souls on board, and something's, that doesn't have a transponder code and isn't answering the radio, is getting close to them. And the pilots see it. Well, you got to deal with that. And unfortunately, the stigma there can be deadly at times, in that industry. You know what I mean? Nobody wants that on their record. I mean, The Pan Am 160 flight that saw the Shag Harbour craft coming in that had a near collision with it, the pilot decided that he didn't want to file a report. It was a cargo flight. There wasn't passengers on it, but you had the flight crew of 3, and there was a crew deadheading back, and the flight engineer went back and woke them up. So you had 6 pilots like in the cockpit watching this, right? But the captain that was in charge, right? He didn't want that on the record, and Logan asked them, in the communication, he said, "No, we don't want to file a report." He asked them the second time.
Such a hard one. It really is.
It makes sense, though. It does make sense, because back then, and I know this because my brother graduated in '69, he wanted to be a commercial airline pilot, and his guidance counselor told him, "It's not going anywhere. You need to find a real job." So there wasn't a lot of flight back then. So I would be afraid of losing my job reporting something like that. I'd probably be tested and screened, and
there were people in higher positions than that. I mean, I remember Carl Sagan, brilliant man. And he never admitted. He always came across as a skeptic. He never admitted that he believed in UFOs.
He's kind of a closet ufologist, actually.
Well, I like I said, he worried about, I'm not going to get any funding for, our other research if I go public and say I believe. But he did talk to somebody about it and said, what, he was a believer. And then he went on to founded, heavily involved in SETI, founded, the Dolphin Organization. Like, he really finally just went with it.
Do he was a classmate of Stanton Friedman's?
Was he?
Was he really?
At Cornell. At Cornell, yeah. They did.
Yeah.
They had nothing to do. They had nothing to do with each other at the time.
Isn't that
Stanton
funny?
wasn't into UFOs yet. They were classmates at one point.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Funny. I mean, he'd be quoted as saying, "I'm going to be, I'm going to be those UFO, followers' worst nightmare." Blah blah blah. But he goes, really? He goes, "I just couldn't risk, not getting funding for." Our other research. And then it's like he came out of the closet one day and everybody's like, wow.
Carl Sagan believed that extraterrestrials may have been here. And in fact, he thought it was a reasonable explanation for the astronomical knowledge that one of the African tribes held about the star Sirius and about what stars were double stars, because they didn't have telescopes or anything, right? And one of the things he thought that was possible is that extraterrestrials had come here in spacecraft in their technology, but that he didn't believe it was happening every other weekend or whatever, or even once in 10 years. He thought it might be once in 10,000 years, but he was open to that concept and believed that might have been an explanation for some of this knowledge among certain primitive tribes. And the other thing about Uncle Carl, as Stanton used to call him, Uncle Carl, is that Stanton didn't like to admit this, but the fact was that when Blue Book was shut down, there were people like the Harvard astronomer Donald Menzel that wanted to destroy the files, and Sagan fought hard for them to be preserved, and eventually got the American Philosophical Society to accept them. So, it's probably going a bit far to say he was a closet believer, but he was open to the possibility and thought it may have happened, but he thought it was much rarer than the UFO field portrays, right?
Well, he took it another level when they opened up, started working with dolphins, because they believed that dolphins could be the key to communicating with, extraterrestrials, just because of the fact that, they were smarter than most people. They would pass IQ tests more than and beat out like human beings. But there's a lot of belief that they would be the ones to be able to teach the language of extraterrestrials to humanity. And it made me go back and think about Star Trek 4, where they came in and there was a ship coming in to destroy the planet, and they were looking for humpback whales to communicate with. Do you remember that?
Oh, wow.
And they had to go back in time to get, they had to steal 2 humpback whales from an aquarium and dump them in the ocean so they would communicate with this ship. And I went, that's pretty brilliant. Like Gene Roddenberry himself was said to know, like that guy knew a lot that he just wasn't talking about, So
I think that what Sagan got across so well in his fictional work, Contact, is the fact that when it comes to another alien technology, when you see the whole meeting on the beach, some people think that was disappointing and some thought it was silly. But actually, to me, it was quite brilliant because, as Sagan used to say in some of his works, is, there won't, when we find an alien technology or get that first signal, there's not going to be a Rosetta Stone.
Right.
We're not going to suddenly find a key that's going to open up communication to us. It's going to be much more difficult and challenging than that. It might not even be possible, in fact. And I think that's what he got across so well in that movie. It's a great work. He was a great mind. I mean, and even the skeptics, there are some of them that do good work. There are some that don't do any work and just,
Let me ask you this then. Curiosity, just because, the whole, everybody's going, oh, disclosure crazy, over the course of the next week is supposed to start going down. So what are your thoughts? Should people, because people have mixed feelings about disclosure, about,
I'll tell you my feelings. I'll tell you my feelings.
Yeah. Do you think we should fear them, or do you think we should be open to it?
Well, I think we need both things in ufology. Myself, I'm not in the disclosure camp. I've been hearing, I'm 65 now.
Right. And
I've been hearing ever since I was interested in UFOs, I was a rather young boy, that, it's coming. They're getting this ready. They're going to release them, whatever. But it hasn't ever happened. The other thing is, maybe I'm the cynic, but if I don't believe the government when they're saying there's nothing to this, why would I believe when they suddenly said, hey, here's the answer? I'd be just as skeptical from either point of view from an authoritarian agency or government. I'd have to get out of the armchair and prove it for myself somehow. You know what I mean? And that's the trouble with science, and it's certainly the thing with politics. It's not like Buddhism where things are always the same and never change. Right. In the world of science, and certainly in the world of politics, in the world of science, the truth changes all the time, right? Just like in medicine, and in politics, it can change every 4 years. And if they suddenly said, okay, we know there were aliens, we're not sure what they're up to, we have a sort of deal with them and all this, I'm not sure I believe that any more than they don't know anything about it right now, So I'm going to view it all very skeptically. But something? I have a lot of friends in the field that are well into the disclosure camp. And you know what I tell them? I hope they rub my nose in it. I'm the sort of guy that wants to knock on doors and get out and find the evidence for himself. I don't care who gets the answer, whether it's SETI, whether it's me, whether it's the hard-nosed, nuts and bolts guys, whoever gets it. But if they get it and the government fesses up and, the paper trail is good and it makes sense, honestly, I keep telling them all the time, look, you guys, I hope you make it. I'd be a happy man if you did it, but I won't hold my breath. But like everybody else, I'm going to watch what release, and I'll probably be able to respond to it. I suspect they'll give us something.
Oh, they're going to give tidbits. I still believe you'll get more. You get better stuff from people, everyday people with camera phones who see it and have no reason to hide it.
But on the other end of that, a picture's no longer worth 1,000 words.
You're right. You're correct.
Not in digital. Not in digital anymore. No.
That's right. You can do anything with your desktop, right?
Correct. And it's sad that it's come to that, really.
No, but I've been watching with everybody else, and
right.
The government does know more than what they're saying, and we need to know that. We're not children. We deserve to know, and it's our tax dollars at work, right? So they owe us something, the way I look at it. But I'm going to be looking at that just as fine and just as skeptically as I do every time I find a document or hear somebody's story, right? I mean, there's a difference. I try to keep an open mind to all of it. And the thing is, but you don't want to open that door so far that your brain falls out on the ground either,
No. Stay logical.
I want to find the kind of evidence that satisfies me, but also would convert any skeptic. That's what we need. That's what we don't have. I've often said I want the door off the thing so I can walk up and drop it on the stage and it makes a big noise when it hits.
Okay, so you need the ship to pretty much just land on the front lawn, allow you to videotape it, Invite a few friends over so you have witnesses.
I want an artifact. I
The
want
whole
a piece of
gambit.
it.
Yeah, I
I'm gonna
feel
say, you must have something aboard you don't need on the return
Yeah,
trip.
just throw me a
Something.
morsel, anything, tidbit.
Give
the
me something
entire
I can't get.
paranormal. Sorry,
Right.
go ahead, Chris. Sorry.
No. You go ahead. Go ahead.
No, thank you. I just think the whole paranormal field requires that. It just seems to be at that point.
Ufology also. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
No,
yeah.
all of it, like ufology, paranormal, all of it. It just needs to be right in your face. It's ridiculous. You know, they'll say, I can't believe in something I don't see. I'm like, but you believe in God. You can't see.
Yeah, even the
But
Bible is full of
anyways,
UFO sightings. I think you need to do a
absolutely.
station ID before we go
I
on to the next
do
question.
right now.
Okay.
If you're just
On
tuning
it.
in, you're listening to The Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and myself, Amelia Pisano, and our amazing guest, Chris Stiles, is here with us tonight. If you're in the beautiful New Orleans, you're listening to us on 107.7 FM and 105.3 FM radio. And we are International Public Radio, and we are United Public Radio, partially sponsored tonight by our amazing sponsors, Folgers Coffee. Thank you so much, Folgers.
Thank you, Folgers.
It's a mouthful.
I know, it's a lot to say, but woo!
Yay! You go, Chris.
It's for the best.
Great pencil case.
I love it.
Right? I love their containers. It's a great piggy bank too.
Oh, yeah.
Just saying. It's mad money.
So, I mean, you had an amazing experience. I've seen UFOs. I grew up, Northern Ontario, and my grandfather was very comfortable with it, and my parents also, and we'd see them, and the next day you'd see the military swarming around looking for something. So it's like, all right, so that was a thing.
Michelle, the sword sighting that we had in 2018,
yes,
the exact same thing, and there were photos from that taken, happened very near North Bay in a place called Mattawa.
I know Mattawa. I'm from like Sudbury.
50 weeks before my sighting, the exact same thing, and there were pictures there. It was taken over Mattawa.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well,
Since
that's
you mentioned
interesting.
Ontario, yes.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. And both those cases are MUFON cases that are on file that have numbers, and
Wow.
Yeah, have had investigations. Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up seeing them. To me, it was just natural, to look to the stars and see something. Back then, they didn't have all these satellites. The space station was like not a thing. It was just like you saw the Big Dipper. It's like, wow, that's as good as it got.
I was always connecting the dots at school.
Well, for example, when Shag Harbour happened in '67, there were only 600 things in orbit then.
Wow.
We now probably have 60,000 or something.
Yeah.
Or more, yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy how many satellites.
Is October the 4th, 67 was exactly 10 years to the day after the launch of Sputnik, the first man-made object in orbit.
Oh, I did not know that.
That was October the 4th, 57. Wow. So 10 years later to the day. 10 years later to the day. Just to give you some timeline there.
No, that's fascinating. Cool. No, that's fascinating. I think, people in the cities often get gypped because growing up again up north, we have a crisp, clear sky at night. Even when I visit now, I look up and I realize there's no light, there's no canopy. It's just black and just the stars. You see everything. You come down, you live down southern Ontario. It's just, you have just reflections from the light everywhere, city after city after city. Where we are now, in Niagara is just, it's actually pretty good because you do have a lot of areas that it is just really dark and you see them pretty regularly. And all of a sudden you just see something shoot up straight and then you see it just gone. And it's like, that was a thing. So, then you see some helicopter just hightail it right after because here we have the U.S. military base across the river and they hightail pretty soon after. So I was just like, I like to see that because that verifies that it's something interesting that they're going after.
The trouble with my city the trouble with my city is fog.
Would be.
Well, Toronto
and drizzle, fog and drizzle most times.
Yeah.
Wow.
Toronto, you can't hear or see anything.
No.
No, here it is.
There's always choppers in the air because of all the news stations. There's always weather people. There's everything. You're not going to hear anything, not over the traffic, whether it's day or night. You know, it doesn't matter. Even the lockdown hasn't even affected it. It's just crazy. But yeah, I would have loved to have lived up north rather than grow up in the city, because it's just so much more of an experience. You have more stars too. Like everything's just so much more beautiful.
We have the Northern Lights, which were pretty awesome. You know, across the entire sky, not just one little corner, which is you know, meteor showers. You got to really enjoy it. And again, seeing UFOs. You know, you're out at my grandparents owned an island out on Lake Wanapitei, which was like, you know, huge, but was way out there. And you just sit out there and you just see things just fly across the sky, just going across way up, you know, and you don't really give it another thought. You just get used to seeing things like that and late at night, and that's that. Now down here, it's just like, you know, you'd think you'd see more of them, but I completely agree. You know, Chris, you've got 60,000 satellites up there. What is real? You look at a photograph, you know, unless you're right there with the person who takes it on the spot.
If you've got Chinooks flying over your house, that's pretty.
It's true.
That's pretty damning evidence.
A picture's no longer worth 1,000 words. You need other corroborating evidence. You know, like I mean, I'm not saying it's valueless, but you know, without other witnesses, a time frame, radar, whatever, you know, you need something else, you know.
Proper documentation.
Just too much. There's too much fake out there right now.
Yeah, it's just so easily manipulated, you know. I think the strangest things are these things you'll see on YouTube where you have, you know, some giant animal that they're claiming is real, just the most ridiculous scale of something swallowing a ship or something. Oh my. There's enough wonder and there's enough great and mysterious stuff in the world. You don't need to fabricate anything, you know.
I think maybe it's just that people crave wanting to see something so desperately. You know, that's like, okay, we're just going to put it out there. I don't know. I've been fortunate. I've seen some pretty amazing things, you know, in my travels. I've traveled the world, you know, and I've been to many parts of the world, and I've seen really interesting things, you know, and yes, you want to share it with everybody, but honestly, I think experiences aren't meant for everybody. Sometimes it's meant for you.
Well, sometimes there are some people I think that can't see UFOs. There's the other extreme too.
I think that's
they look at it and their mind doesn't allow them to accept what they're seeing, right?
I have to agree with you.
Sometimes you see something very unusual and you do learn the nature. I mean, one of the things I'm quite proud of is that, you know, in my work on Shag Harbour and other cases down east here, I've solved a number of old cases, you know, definitively solved them. And the people are usually quite willing to accept the answer, the pilots or whatever. Sometimes years later, you'll piece it together. And it's satisfying in a different way. It's a little bittersweet. You know, you know, a good one gets away, but you know, I want them to be real. You know, I don't want to be fooling myself here or anything, you know. And
also on the other side, who knows how many times you've looked at something that's real and just assumed it's fake because of the CGI quality nowadays. You could be flipping through many real shots and not even know it.
But good observations, like you know, it's hard to resist interpreting that. I'll give you a funny example of something that happened to me in my life. Nothing to do with UFOs, but I didn't know what I was looking at. There was a winter day. Oh, this was in the 70s, earlier 70s. Forget the exact date. And I was coming in. I was driving on a coastal road here, coming in from Lawrencetown toward Dartmouth, and it was almost dark out. And I looked out to sea. I was up on a hill by something, a great landmark near Lawrencetown Beach called McDonald House, and I looked out to sea, and something wasn't making sense. And I pulled the car out. And it looked at me like there was two horizons. You know, you could see the horizon you always see with the ocean, right? And then above it, there was just an equally distinct line. And I knew that, you know, in the cold and in these conditions and low light, you know, it wouldn't be like a mirage or, you know, a temperature inversion or anything. And I kept looking, you could clearly see it. It was like there was two horizons. And I thought, what is that? And I couldn't make any sense. And I kept thinking, you know, drove home, went to bed. Well, when I got up in the next morning, I found the answer. I was living in downtown Dartmouth, right by the waterfront, and I got up and I opened the curtains and looked out the window, and the harbor, Halifax is our northernmost ice-free port. There's never ice in the harbor, right? And I looked out, and all I could see was ice, pack ice in the harbor. And
Wow.
none of the old timers here, it had never come in. But
Yeah,
the
so
winds
that
were
doesn't
on that
happen.
year, and the ferry didn't run. I mean, the ferry ran through the Halifax explosion 100 years ago,
I know.
But
Wow.
you couldn't move. You could walk across the harbor, and we'd never seen it here. And 3 or 4 days later, the wind. So what I was seeing was the pack ice coming in out to sea. But at the time, it looked almost otherworldly. This second horizon. And I thought, what am I looking at? Well, that was the edge of the pack ice advancing toward us. At sunset, I was saying. But at the time, it would have made no sense. But once I opened the window, I'm like, that's what it is.
I think that's what people need to do, is slow down a little bit and really pay attention to their surroundings. I mean, I've had people, write into me and say, driving, and then they look up and then they see a craft just going alongside the car, not close. I mean, off in the distance, and then they turn, and then it just seems to, she's like, okay, that's just really bizarre. I mean, I don't know. I think sometimes you get so busy with air traffic, would you even notice? I mean, if you live out near Toronto, you sure in heck wouldn't notice.
No, not with the airport. No. You have four or five airports right there.
Yeah.
No.
Again, the misinterpretation thing. I've seen people spot the ISS going over, when it's a night when you get good ground truth. It's almost directly overhead. And it's that right time after the sunset, and it's catching sunlight from over the horizon. They look at it, and they're going, what's that? Look at that. That's not a plane. That's not a... No,
it's huge. You can't miss it looking at it in the sky.
It's the ISS.
Yes.
And they go, well, how do you know? And I said, watch this. And it gets about 3/4 of the way across, and say there's no clouds in the sky, right?
Right.
And all of a sudden, very quickly, it dims and disappears before it's reached the horizon. And they're going, look at that. What did it do? Did it go stealth? Did it disappear? I go, no, it entered the Earth's shadow.
They're watching too much television, Chris.
And they look so disappointed when you tell them that. It entered the Earth's shadow.
Aww.
And you go onto a website like heavensabove.com, and they'll predict right to the second when it's going to do that. You can look it up and verify that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Even NASA Live will show it too.
Right.
Yeah, they're very disappointed. Yeah.
No, it's true. It's true. I mean, do people fear them? Should they fear them? Should they not fear them? There's a lot of, you look at even Stephen Hawking. No, bad idea. Bad idea. Shouldn't be, you don't want to be transmitting into space. You don't want to tell them you were peaceful. They're going to think we're not armed. They're going to take over. But he's not the only one. There are several like that. And then you have your yays and your nays. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts?
Careful.
I don't know.
Just hypothetical.
No, I'm just saying the emails that you're going to get if you go up against Hawking or Tesla.
No. There's the pros and the cons, and there's a lot of valid.
I used to go on TV and disagree with Stanton, and people
this
guy, he goes on and he disagrees with Stanton, and they go, what does Friedman say?
What's wrong with you? Yeah.
So Stephen Hawking. Listen, Stephen Hawking was a brilliant physicist, right? And as far as his speculation, I think we'd all be better not to speculate about alien motivation. I don't know what it is. He's in that War of the Worlds camp, and then, in our times, we all got used to the sort of Steven Spielberg version of benevolent space brothers.
So. But is that a mistake, do you think, or is it not?
Would you come all this way just for whatever it is they want here? Food, palladium, salt water. I don't know.
Okay, I don't know.
They would have blown us up by now.
I don't know either. If their purposes were malevolent and you're able to travel this far, I'm sure we'd be easy pickings.
Sure. Oh, it would have happened by now, right?
I'm not seeing the evidence of that, right? Yet, it's like the whole abduction scenario thing. If what they say happen. These people. If
Mhm.
what I'm saying I believe is true, then that's a possibility, right? But I
Anything's a
find
possibility. I mean, out of all the different species that allegedly exist out there, you're going to have your bad ones, you're going to have your better ones, your good ones, your great ones, just much
again
like
multiple
people imagine.
causes for the unknowns, right?
Sure,
Mm-hmm.
sure.
If it's aliens, it's probably multiple aliens, but it's probably other things too. I think the unknowns have multiple causes.
Mhm.
I think all you need to do is look at all the details, the certain details that hold up, right?
Right.
And when people they say, well, why would the aliens do that? But you can't even ask that question. Why do
Mm.
we still bother dolphins and capture them and take them away? The
I
dolphin down
know.
below looking up sees a boat. It's an unidentified floating object. It comes up. Sometimes they're taken and returned, putting a tracker on them or whatever. Sometimes they're taken and never brought back.
Hey,
And
there's
we
stories of
True.
dolphins being abducted. Never mind.
well, that's right. But that's what we're
Right,
doing. We abduct
right out of
dolphins.
the aquariums, gone.
Well,
Middle of
there
the
you
day.
go. But I mean,
Oh
we're
my
abducting
God.
them from their world, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know,
Full circle then.
if we can analyze like what's dangerous or not.
Mm.
I think there's a lot of in between. And here's what I find in the most credible cases. Something confusing. Let me tell you one story. Uh, how much time do we have? Do we have another?
Oh, yeah, man. You got like
Go
15,
ahead.
20 minutes. Go
Oh,
crazy.
cool. Well, you're
Lots
gonna
of
like
time.
this one because what I found is that when I dig into them and I track the old police cases and that
Mm-hmm.
ones I did a little study where I found cases that were very pure, I would call it, ufologically.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, like they weren't in the media, nobody ever went and tried to find me or go to a show. I tracked down police cases that were very pure. And when I did this in Nova Scotia, I found cases that were astounding because they didn't fit any of the slots.
Mm.
And this is what led me to reconsider the work of Jacques Vallée and reality transformation. I'm going to give you one really good example. You're going to like it. In fact, I found this in Stanton Friedman's basement, the police report. He gave me a box of documents, so I'll never forget.
How
God
cool.
bless him. Here's the thing. I went home and I read this report, and it was a one-page RCMP report from 1976, October again, that time of year.
Mm.
And in it, it talks about, Lower Sackville is a bedroom community just outside Halifax, Dartmouth here, near that end of the Bedford Basin. And in it, a woman calls up, Mrs. Percy Webster was her name. And she calls the RCMP in the nearby Bedford detachment and says, could you send an officer to my house? There's a UFO over it. Now, this is a Sunday night near midnight. So they dispatch an officer, a young fellow, Constable Ferrand was his name. And he comes to the area and he knocks on the door and he asks her to step out. And they look up and he goes, actually, you have 3 UFOs over your house. This is all in the RCMP report. Then they look up. He
Wow.
hangs around the house for 2 hours. And she makes him coffee and brings it out. He goes to the car radio and contacts the airport, Halifax International, as it was known then, and Shearwater, the base in Dartmouth, a large naval aviation base there. They're not painting anything on radar, but he can see it. He contacts other Mountie cars in the distance, and they're seeing it from their vantage points. Okay. And what they're seeing is a lozenge sort of tubular craft in 3 sections. The middle part's like a tea strainer, and there's a green light moving, and it's got a flat bottom and lights on it. There's no sound. The officer estimates they're about 500 feet over the house, hovering there. So after 2 hours, he tells her, well, I've got to leave. He said, if they get closer, you feel threatened, call us back. I'll come back.
Hmm.
And he leaves.
Wow.
And at the end, he says, and he mentions 2 people, and he says, and the neighbors were also witnesses of Mr. and Mrs. Robert Bedford. And in those days, in these reports, they didn't blank anything out. There was no Privacy Act. Everybody's
Mm-hmm.
phone number was still there in that. And I read this, and at the end, he says, in the opinion of the writer of this report, what I've seen was something quite unusual and could not have been an aircraft or astronomical object, because with my field glasses, I would have known the difference. Well, I thought, geez, I got to go out there someday because it had the lady's address at the time and whatever. One day when I was in the air, I just went to the door unannounced and knocked on her door, and she came in and said, oh, I'd love to talk to you. Her husband had passed on by this time because it was
Oh.
94 by the time I'd found her. This case had occurred. I'm sorry. Yeah, in 76. So anyway, she basically tells me with no embellishments what's in it. Says I've been looking for years, hoping I'd see something in. Thought I did a number of times, but no, I didn't. But we know what we seen that night, and the RCMP officer seen it too, and the guys he called on the radio. Okay, that's all very interesting as far as it goes. But here's where it takes a turn. I said, well, what about your neighbors? It mentions the Bedfords, your neighbors. Oh, she said, I think they're away. She says, but it wouldn't do you any good to talk to them. I said, why not? Well, she says, I don't think they'd want to talk about it. They're very serious Christian people, and we don't much get along with the neighbors. And I said, well, thank you for the warning, but I said, in the interest of completeness, I think I'll do. She goes, well, I'm pretty sure they're away, but good luck with that. And we parted. I went next door and knocked, and there was no answer. Well, I had a phone number in the Mountie report, so I kept calling the number, for the next few weeks. And eventually somebody did answer the phone. A gentleman answered one day, and I asked, is this Mr. Robert Bedford? Yes, he says. And I told him who I was and why I was calling him. I said, your name appeared in a UFO report. I'd like to discuss some details of your sighting if you'd be willing. And he says, a what? I said, a UFO report. Whoa, he says, I've never seen anything like that. Well, of course, now I'm already considering the warning of Mrs. Webster. And I say, okay. And he says, whose report? I said, well, your neighbors, the Websters. And as soon as I mentioned the name, he goes, oh, the Websters. Well, they could see anything. So this is not looking so good suddenly, right? And I think, well, I said, however, the RCMP responded and they did see it. And he goes, you know what? I don't even think we lived here then. Really? And I could hear his wife in the background, like coming up the hall toward him, talking on his old landline, right? And she says, dear, who is it? Who's on the phone? Oh, he goes, the Webster saw a UFO or something. And I can hear her saying, dear, that was the night, the night. And he says, just a minute. And he covers the phone and I can't hear anything for 10 or 20 seconds. And then he comes back on and he goes, yes, he goes, I'm very sorry. I know what you're talking about now. And then he said, just a minute. He goes, dear, when did we move down from Ontario? And he goes, were we here then? And yes, she said, we came that summer. Yes, yeah. He goes. And then he said, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I said, so you did see a UFO? He goes, no, I didn't. Well, I said, your name's down on the report. I said, can you explain this? Yes, he said, and I'm sorry that I said what I said about the neighbors. He said, we don't get along with the neighbors. And I almost laughed because
I said the same thing.
I don't get along with the neighbors. He said, but I shouldn't have said that. He says, I'm a Christian. And he says, I don't want to leave a wrong impression about somebody because that really wasn't fair. We don't get along. But no, he says, I know what you mean. I said, no, I understand. You don't have to like everybody. He said, no, but we have to love them. That's part of my faith. I said, well, I'm not a person of faith, but I respect that with no end, So then I said, so why is your name here? Well, he says, I'm not very proud of this. He says, but I know the night you're talking about. He goes, and me and the wife are hiding under the bed. Okay. I said, can you tell me a little more? Well, he said, there was this awful noise. Now, the Mountie and the other family are standing on the front lawn. They're not hearing anything. This house is right next door. You could chuck a pebble underhand and hit it. And he's saying the whole house was shuddering and the noise, it was the most ungodly roar. He said, listen, I'm a naval architect and I fly in Sea Kings and Labradors all the time. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was low over the house and I didn't want to know what it was. I knew it wasn't good. And I said, really? Ironically, he turned out to be one of the fellows that designed the building at the Shelburne base, by the way, Canada's most secret base. It ties in with Shag Harbour. That came out later. But anyway, so I said, but the house is shaking. I said, the Websters and the RCMP officer, he doesn't hear anything. He goes, well, I don't know. I said, well, how did you come to communicate or meet with him then? He said, that's the strangest part of the whole thing. He says, this roar was going on. We just hoped it would stop. And suddenly it just stopped like he'd flipped a switch. And when it did, I could hear this knocking at the door. So I went downstairs and it was the RCMP officer. He wanted me to come out in the front lawn. And I just looked past him. I saw the Websters out there. He said, so I wouldn't come out.
Oh.
And I told him about what they had experienced, and I said, "Well, what do you think that was?" He says, "I don't know." He says, "I don't want to know." Now, none of these people ever went to the press. None of them went to a radio station. None of them looked me up or what. I found this story through a police report.
Yeah.
But when I went and found the other witnesses, both who were reluctant, both of these people, none who trusted each other, this is the story they told. What was that?
That's wow.
And I found other cases like this in Nova Scotia. And to me, this is way more fascinating than some of the ones that you can easily pigeonhole and say, oh, abduction, landing case, what is that? Because I have no doubt that that's what these people saw and experienced in the same place at the same time.
And how many more like them are out there?
Totally different. Well, I believe that the reality transformation thing accounts for this because, to my mind, Jacques Vallée called it that. I call it controlled witness perception. Somehow, something in this phenomena, whether it's alien or whatever, is able to go in and actually control the perception. Something a little more intentional than the screen memories claimed by people like Whitley Strieber, who, by the way, was the editor of my U.S. book, the little book that come out through Del Bantam. But I mean, and stories like this, I've included in the last Canadian book I have up here. It's available on Amazon called Impact to Contact. There's a shameless plug. But in that, you'll find these kind of stories, and you don't find them in most places. They're very different. And this is the great stuff you find when you get over the armchair and you start knocking on doors and you get out there. You think about this. If we had only communicated by email, I wouldn't have heard his wife in the hallway.
No.
That's true. No.
If I hadn't gone and knocked on Mr. Webster's door, you get the point. The more intimate the communication, the more information you will discern. The more
a lot of that is gone too. Everything is digital now.
People don't answer their doors now. It's different.
Well, they might up your neck of the woods.
Not here. Not here.
Yeah. Well, they do here, but this is the value of when you can do a face-to-face interview, and that's why it was so lucky that I found people like Squadron Leader William Bain that ran the air desk in Ottawa, that I found, people like the eyewitnesses, that were able to give you those hard details that raised us to the case of an extraterrestrial crash, or the case like the Webster case, as I refer to it, where I think that's how things like these RT cases play out. You know what I mean? And I find these cases where you don't know what's coming next. I'll tell you, when that was recounted to me, I mean, the hair stands up on your neck, and because there's no reason, there's no motivation for these people, not simply to lie, but to even embellish the details.
Well, they haven't gone public with the information.
No, this has happened. There's nothing in it for them.
That's right.
They didn't know I was coming along. They were reluctant to give it out, but when they tell you, it's fascinating. And often I find these cases, and then you'll find when you go back, because the RCMP reports, it's just raw data. They just put it down, write what you see, write what you're told.
Right.
And when you go in and you go through these cold cases, and we're so lucky here in Canada, these RCMP files that are largely available through our National Archive system, it's something that I've been able to exploit. In the U.S., often law enforcement in a little community, would be a sheriff or whatever. But the RCMP is one of the few police forces in the world that it operates as a national police force, as a provincial police force, and as local police forces. But they have a lot of training and a high standard. They don't do anything. You can't fill up the gas tank without filling out a piece of paper. You can't decide, well, I'm not going to write this up. It doesn't work that way. And it's a legacy that I've been able to exploit on some of these Canadian cases, and in fact, like their policy about what happens if something crashed from space that we didn't know what it was, and how I get that released, that gets a chapter in that last Canadian book I had come out, Impact to Contact. And ironically, this was so funny. The Mountie was so embarrassed because when they finally released it to me, get this. I requested, remember I mentioned earlier, it was called the Space Object Contingency Space Object Contingency Plan. He said, don't read too much into this, but there's an alternative title on the cover page. He says, it's unfortunate. And I kept saying, well, what is it? He goes, it's called the Master Plan.
Oh, master
And this
plan.
shows our working relationship with the U.S. on what happens. And we do see there is such a thing. And another example of how it played out in a practical way is back in the 70s, a Soviet nuclear satellite crashed in the far north, and Canadian and U.S. forces had to work together to retrieve all the debris and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And all that was laid out in the same thing, because it's not just about UFOs, but satellites, space junk, whatever, a meteorite, anything that falls from space that's a hazard. These are the rules, and like if it happens in Canada, the RCMP, once they get there, they're in charge. If U.S. officials get there, once Canadian Armed Forces get there, if it's on Canadian soil, they're the lead agency. All the rules are spelled out, how far to keep people downwind, if there's radiation, what to do. It was an amazing thing. And, that's a chapter in my book and that. But like I say, it's a different system here. It's not totally different than the U.S. We have problems with it too. But it's much more open. There's a clear set of rules, and I've been able to exploit them. And
I like that. I've been able to exploit them. For all you 2 million people who are listening.
Well,
exploit the rules. No, I like that. It makes you badass.
No, but I mean, it's our tax dollars at work. If it's there, if you preserve it, why can't I see it?
Right. No, I agree with you. I agree with you completely. I'm glad that there are people such as yourself that go out there and dig, because there's so many stories that are you just will not ever hear. And just like the one you mentioned, it's interesting. I find it interesting that you have two houses side by side, and one house isn't experiencing anything and one house is experiencing
something completely different. Yeah.
Exactly. And yet it's a stone throw away. It's just fascinating to me.
Yeah. Well, I believe there's two types of reality transformation. There's the ones where everybody perceives it the same, and there's the one where the witness is being controlled to see something different, for reasons unknown, right? I mean, I think it's just a step beyond what Whitley Strieber speculated about, like in books like Communion, where he said, sometimes somebody might have a memory of running into a herd of deer where they shouldn't, the large eyes, and this is a screen memory placed to hide the abduction experience or whatever. Well, maybe that's it. Maybe it's a different reason, but here's the cool part when you think about it. When you have two people experience something in the same place at the same time, totally different, to me, it's self-evident. It's a proof in itself that you're dealing with something otherworldly, something unconventional here. You know what I mean? It's not mass hysteria. It's not everybody seeing it the same. So when that happens, the cool thing about that is its own proof. I find those cases very exciting.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to know more. I think maybe we should bring you back sometime just with other stories that you have maybe.
Oh, that's possible. I was a busy guy in the 90s, let me tell you.
Yeah, I guess so.
I can't wait.
But that makes us very grateful. So before we go, tell everybody where to find you, what you've got coming up, anything you want to plug, website, anything like that. Events.
Well, there's nothing too imminent because, like right here, we're all dealing with COVID, and the rules here in Canada, particularly in this little province, have been very strict.
Right.
And in fact, we were going to have a big conference down in Yarmouth near Shag Harbour, a UFO expo, and we had a number of U.S. researchers coming, Nick Pope, Debbie Ziegelmeyer, and others, right? And that's going to be delayed, unfortunately, till October 2022, because we can't guarantee the border would be open. We probably couldn't even bring in the talent, let alone tickets. But there's a great website that will track that, what it's going to be. Luckily, all our speakers have recommitted to appear in October 2022. Shag Harbour UFOexpo.com is the website, and it'll have all the story details. Anybody that wants to know about Shag Harbour or other cases I've investigated that you probably have never heard about or never heard anything like them, my most recent book is Impact to Contact. It's available through Amazon. They want a bit too much for it, the deal I had with the other co-author, but it's unique. You'll hear the kind of stories I told here and more. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you for joining us. We've been waiting patiently for this segment, but yeah,
awesome.
it was really informative. I really do enjoy like hearing the Canadian tales because you just don't hear them very much. I grew up north with tons of sightings. It wasn't uncommon to sit around with friends around a campfire and share those exact kind of stories. It's just like, but like
the native perspective can be very interesting too.
Oh yes,
the native perspective and their stories. Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. So you see, I'm going to be in touch with you on that, and I think I'd like to do this again if you're willing.
I'd be willing.
Thank you.
Go down the road.
Yay!
I love your perspective. I love your perspective.
Yeah.
I love your methodology. I love all of it. You're just so incredible. Thank you.
Well, next time we'll have to talk about some of the dirty tricks I've learned.
We're definitely going to do that.
Leaving your suitcase behind with the tape recorder running in it. You get out the door and then, I forgot it. And you come back and you hear what they said after the door closed.
See, that's crafty.
That's very Maxwell Smart. I'm aging myself.
There we go.
You find a department, you send in 50 requests to every staffer that works there. One person doesn't check with higher authority. 49 people say no, and you get one yes. And I only need
always.
That's all it takes. Well, Chris,
persistence pays off. It's been a pleasure, ladies.
Thank you. It absolutely was a pleasure for us also. And I will be in touch. And the only way you get out of this studio is if you click that little leave studio button there. No, a lot of people will sit there and go, how do I get out of here? So now I'm just letting you know, it's a little button at the bottom that says leave studio.
Oh, yeah, the red one. Yes.
Yeah, otherwise you're stuck with us for the night.
That's it.
Yeah. Thank you for the heads up on that. Yeah, I'm not that
I know. I got to start including it in the emails. Heads up.
I probably left it till morning to solve.
Yeah, come back. Find you sitting here. That's all right. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chris.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Amelia.
Good night, Chris. Thank you.
Well, we've come to the end of another awesome segment. Holy cow, that was really good. Wowzers. Thank you all who tuned in tonight. Thanks to everybody in the chat room. You guys are always a pleasure to see. I love watching and reading all your comments. So big thank you to Chris Stiles. Humongous thank you to Folgers Coffee for partially sponsoring tonight's show. Please remember to stop by International Public Radio, UFO, Paranormal Radio. I'm not saying the other because I can't remember it for the life of me. Anyway, just go and subscribe. While you're there, please feel free to show us some love over on our group page at The Outer Realm on Facebook and Instagram. If you want to see a guest, you want to see a topic, maybe you're interested in coming on yourself, please email at theouterrealmcontact@gmail.com. That's theouterrealmcontact@gmail.com. It does take me a while to get back to people. Honestly, I do get a lot of emails. Please tune in next week as we welcome back two more amazing guests. Yes, welcoming back Wednesday night, Mr. Steve Burgess will be back on the show. Thursday night, we welcome Daryl Sims, the alien hunter, back to the show. Until then, Amelia and I thank you. Have a good night. Have a safe weekend, and we shall see you next week. Good night.